Making the workflow and delays visible using Kanban boards. Today's topic of discussion. Hi, I'm Joshua Barnes, and I'm joined once again by Al Shalloway. And we're super excited to be doing this first live stream. We'll probably be doing a lot on this topic, as this topic is tied into a new series of mini workshops that we have used in consulting engagements, and we're now going to be making these short workshops that are very focused, available for our open enrollment style of training. So what I'd like to do is Al, how about if you get us going, and we'll cover a bit on some of the misunderstandings of Kanban, and then we'll get into how we have formed an agenda and some exercises that are tied into all of this.
Yeah. Thanks, Joshua. I this this presentation has a flashback to me back to 2009 when David and Anderson and I put on the Miami Lean Kanban conference. That was the first Kanban conference, basically. And then shortly thereafter formed Lean Kanban University, which is now Kanban University, and which I'm not affiliated with anymore. But I remember what we used to do back in the day when we were just doing Kanban. And a lot of the misconceptions from back then are still prevalent today. This is unfortunately not uncommon in the agile space. About we improve, but that knowledge doesn't get across. So I wanted to talk about four things that I think are common questions. And one thing is to be very clear about what a Kanban board is conceptually, not what it is, like how it looks, but what is it conceptually. And it really represents a visual explanation of how the team has decided to work. In other words, it's a set of agreements up on a board, and then it's both the work and the agreements that are on the board. And it's also clear, not something to follow. I've heard that sometimes. Oh, Kanban boards, are you following the board? No, you never follow the board. The board is simply a visual representation of the work in place and the agreements we have made on how we're working together. So it's what we've said. Now, if you want to do something different from the board and you have a good reason, if it's just a one-off, you could do it, but then go talk to people about it and then maybe improve it, because nothing works perfectly. As George Bach says, some models are useful, all models are wrong, some are useful. Well, that's your Kanban board. It's a model of how you're working, and we should keep it that way. So we want to improve it on a regular basis. The other point is the real point of Kanban, or not the real point of Kanban, but one of the key points of using Kanban is managing work in process. And back in the day, boy, Kelly, sometimes it takes a long time to break bad habits, because we used to talk about setting WIP limits. And in manufacturing, that works quite well, because in manufacturing, you're trying to, create stability in how things flow through. You have very little variation. Now, not just in software, but any kind of knowledge work, you don't have that. Different things of different sizes come in, they take different lengths of time. And managing your work in process, that's how much stuff you've got going on at any one time. By trying to manage that by saying, oh, I can only have 3 of these waiting in the queue. First of all, it's hard. And second of all, it doesn't always work that well. But more important, there's an easier, better way. And the easier, better way has been around as almost as long as Kanban, called have a focus on finishing. Now, the thing about focusing on finishing, what does that quite mean? Because, I'm going to finish what I'm working on. Well, no, it means actually, yes, that end. Let's say you're working on a story, finishing the feature that story's in. Or if you've got a chunk of value that's going to be an increment, something to release, the increment, release it. In other words, if you're working on a story and you're done with it, that's part of a feature. Finish the feature before you start a story in another feature, or before you start another chunk of work. So it's really, the other question is, when you're done with something, look to see what else you can finish before you start something new. And this is a simple thing to do, and anybody can do it. And it has some significant advantage, because see, if I've got something, and let's say I got WIP limits and I got something, I just done, I can pull something. Notice it's all about me. If I say I'm going to finish something, I could look to help somebody else finish what they're working on, to finish the feature or to finish the increment. And by doing that, we actually encourage collaboration, while at the same time we're lowering the work in process. Now, the reason lowering work in process is so important, and the reason visualizing this is so important, is because most of the problems we have in any kind of knowledge work is working on things you shouldn't be working on. Like an error is made, but you don't discover it because the feedback is delayed. Why is feedback delayed? Because you got big queues. You're working on too much stuff. You're multitasking. You're doing all this crazy stuff. Ellie Goldratt, the creator of Theory of Constraints, once said, sometimes smaller batch sizes is all it takes to bring a system back into control. So smaller things, but also part of that is not having so much fuzz going on. So this focus on finishing and having this explicit workflow can bring things under control. Now, two more things, a little quicker. Sometimes people wonder, well, what's the difference between a Kanban board and a Scrum board? Well, there is no inherent thing. Scrum does not tell you how to run a board. So you could use a Kanban board in Scrum. There's no reason. In fact, I highly recommend it.
Yep.
Still doing Scrum. It doesn't violate anything in Scrum. So I'm talking more historically, I guess, not a mandate, habit. I'm talking habit. Back in the day, and I think it still happens a lot, Scrum boards were like, okay, we've got this sprint backlog, we're pulling it. We should have our definition of done already by the time we get there. But so now it's in play. I've started working on it. I tested it, not tested it. It's ready to go. And the thing is, each of the stories can be done differently because stories are different. And you therefore have stories and little tasks on the stories because each one is different. That's how it's thought. Now, Kanban takes a slightly different view. This is more of a mental attitude, but it's not contrary to Scrum, just a little different, which is to say, well, what we want to do is, yeah, our stuff varies a bit, but more or less we have maybe 2-3 different kinds of stories. Like so we want to have, how do I work when I have this kind of story? How do I work when I have that kind of story? Or maybe how do I work when we have this kind of urgency in it? So a Kanban board is laid out with more columns typically. And instead of tasks, you have what you might do in the Scrum with 3 tasks. You might have 3 extra columns in a Kanban board. Now, obviously, not all things are done the same way. So you have what's called a swim lane for one kind of thing, a swim lane for another kind of thing. And you know what? You could have a swim lane that says, we don't know what this thing is going to look like, so we're going to put tasks on this guy. It's just an agreement. You're not following it. You're coming up with what you need. So I just wanted to make that distinction. Okay, final thing. I'm often asked, how do I know if I've got a good Kanban board? And here's the test. I used to do this when I would go in to, I'm still open to do consulting, but when I was at the PMI, I didn't. So I haven't really gone into a lot of clients. I now teach people how to go into clients so much. But one of the things I would do, they would say, well, how are we doing? I said, okay, give me 10, 15 minutes. And I'd look at the board. Now I understood Kanban. I'm looking at their board. I'm not trying to see how good it is, like are they doing their work well? I'm trying to see, do I understand what they're doing? So I look at the board, usually 5, 10, 15 minutes maybe. And I obviously can't understand it completely, because if you can understand it completely, they got too much documentation up there. But usually there's something off to the side that explains a little bit of the policy. And then what it is I ask questions. I say, what about this? What about this? What about this? If that whole process can be done in 15, 20 minutes, me looking at it for 5 to 15 minutes and asking questions for 5 or 10 minutes, you got a good board. If you can't, if you don't know what's happening by looking at the board in that time period, you don't have a good board. And then you can fix it. Hey, let's talk about this. Let's make it more explicit. So anyway, those are 4 points. I think that are as a kind of can bring us up into some more modern methods about it.
Yeah. So with respect to everything that Al said, what we've done is we've taken a look at how these things can help no matter what type of work you're doing. So if you're working in software, you're working on a digital product, great. I mean, using I'm going to pull up the agenda in just a second to kind of show the things that we cover. However, if you're doing something outside of IT, whether you're a project manager working in non-software space, you're a department manager, you're a worker in a department, we have a lot of examples that we're going to draw on that are from a wide span of work. One of them, a Kanban board from that was derived from work done at a state agency that worked in a content management system. So being able to see varying styles of work and the types of decisions on the workflow is one of the things that we've really focused on in these workshops. So the first thing is workshop is really short. It's 4 hours. It's 4 hours with 3 10-minute breaks. So we've tried to really hone in on what is going to make the biggest impact in being able to understand, making your workflow visible, and then understanding how to also use that to identify delays and see what options you have to solve it. The other thing is that it is an example-based approach. So we've got a little bit of content that goes into some of the things Al's mentioned, a little bit of sort of the background and theory, but it's all grounded in examples, because that's one of the things that we've found, um, both of us delivering quite a bit of training and a lot of consulting services over the years, is most people say, I think I get it, but can you show me an example? So we're going to show you a lot of examples. So the way we've structured the workshop starts off right with an introduction, and then we get right into why visualizing the workflow is so powerful. And it's tied into something like the old saying, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Well, an example and a visualization of your workflow is worth 10,000 words. Then we're going to get into looking at Kanban board examples. Again, we've got software and non-software. We'll take a look at a team-focused Kanban board. And then we get into an exercise where you're going to be able to start a setup for your own Kanban board based on what we're going to be covering. The next thing, we're going to get into creating agreements, right? And I'll mention how important those agreements are. And then we'll do an exercise on creating explicit flow agreements. We'll move on to value stream focused Kanban board. So how do we make sure we're finishing work, right? Focus on finishing. Again, not at the story, just at the story level, but at the feature level, at the increment level, so that we can see across a value stream, right, different levels of work and the connection. Here we can spot things like delays. We can spot the different types of dependencies that we have. Right. And the goal isn't to be super fantastic at managing dependencies, is to try to use options by looking at a visualization like this to remove those cross-team dependencies where we can. From there, we're going to get into detecting delays in the workflow. So using Kanban boards, especially Kanban boards with columns that are cues for when work is waiting, to be able to see how long and how much and what's causing those delays. And then we'll wrap up with connecting planning with execution and Q&As and wrap up. So this is an example-based approach to a very short workshop that will show you how to look at your workflow, how to look at agreements that are really going to help make your work continue to improve from a flow perspective, and a really good way to detect delays. Al, anything on the agenda that you would maybe like to chime in on? And if not, I'll just move over to just a quick look at where you can find more information.
Well, the key that is kind of needs to be really emphasized is two things about Kanban to me. One is, we talk about in lesson 6, detecting delays in the workflow. This is the idea of looking at delay as your big problem is really important. You probably even heard of cost of delay, but Don Reinertson talks about, which means like if consider this. Let's say I have 10 units somehow of value I'm going to deliver over 10 months or after 10 months, versus maybe I can get 1 unit every month. If I get value sooner, then the cost of delay is, what did I lose by getting it later? And that's good. That's really, in fact, that's the one thing he says, if you measure, that's what you should measure.
Yeah.
But there's another cost of delay, the impact of delay, maybe you call it, which is when you get feedback late. Then if you've been doing the wrong thing because of a misunderstanding, you end up doing work you didn't need to be doing. This is really what waste is in lean. A lot of times people debate whether planning or this is waste. No, what's really waste is working on something you shouldn't have because of a delay in feedback. So this is really important. And part of that is communication. And one thing I hadn't mentioned about why you want to focus on finishing, first of all, it's easier, but think of this. I'm a person, I've just finished something, and I mentioned I could, if I'm doing whip limits, I could pull, but that's it all about me. When you say, what else can I finish? I look around me. I look at the people who are in the team, on the team with me. It creates collaboration. It lowers the delays between the steps and the people interacting with each other. So this whole idea of managing whip this way is very important. And I guess that's really it. There's that's the workshop here is one that gives you a very practical setup. Oh no, there was one last thing, because what is Kanban too? There's been, I guess it was seeing the somewhere up there you had something like demystifying. I wrote an article in 2010, I think it was, or 2011, for Cutter called Demystifying Kanban. Because when Kanban came out, it was actually created by 5 people, not me. Dave Anderson was one of them. Corey Lattice was another. I can't remember all the others, but the Dan Bacani was another one. And but the point is people did it differently. There's not a Kanban. Kanban is a system used using the Kanban pull method, but it also based on lean. And one of the things that was different is what David did was what's called a Kanban method, where you start where you are and you do little changes, you do little improvements, like on the board and how you're working. Whereas otherwise, Kanban can start with a big change. Hey, we're going to reorganize and do this and start working this way now. So one of the cool things about Kanban, you can do a big jump to it, to a certain way of doing it, or you can just start exactly where you are, do little changes. But even when you do a big jump, you always see where you are. That's fundamental in lean. Always see where you are, and then make changes from that, and then you could vary the degree of the steps.
Yeah, we've got an excellent question by Thomas, and
Okay.
Thomas, I wholeheartedly, or I can't say I recommend the second one that you've got here the most, which is to have those waiting states, like ready for test and then test. And you want to know why, and here's why. So yeah, though, for one, what we want to do is we want to have explicit agreements for like what it means to be in dev. And dev shouldn't just mean, if we're talking about software or digital product, writing code. It should be for all of the things that are needed, so that when that work item, if we're talking about a story, is ready for test, we can actually do the testing. So we would have an agreement around what it means to be in dev and what it's going to take to move it into that waiting queue in between the two. Now, some of the other things that are really important, and this was something that I've been working with a client for a bit of time on, is when you don't have those waiting queues, and you have, for instance, team members, maybe they're developers, they get done with writing code, and again, if we're talking about software, writing code and hopefully doing their testing, and they move it into test, it looks like there's a lot of work going on in testing, and you have the team members that are responsible for testing, the QA people, that are like, whoa, wait a minute, there might be 10 things that are in that column, but we're working on 2 of them. So it can be very misleading without having those holding queues. And when you have those holding queues, there's a lot of data that you can get from that. Like, why do you have so much work in one of those queues? Again, are you short on testers? Do you have 10 developers for every team member that's got the testing background? Or if you've got a lot that's waiting for validation, is it because you've got an absentee product owner, or that set of tasks or activities for validation? What's causing that? So there's so much more you can glean from having that second approach. Yeah, I could probably talk about this for a lot longer, but I'll stop.
Yeah, another thing though, to be clear, is usually the second approach is when you're trying to manage whip limits at the column. So it's like, well, this is where you'd put your whip limit if you're doing column whip limits as well.
Yeah. Excellent question. Okay, so in the chat, we did put a link to this, which is the upcoming, little bit more of a description and all the upcoming dates. The majority of these, if not all of them, and again, there's more information as we go on down through this. But yeah, so Al and I are co-delivering these. Al and I have co-delivered a lot of value stream management workshops together. So I'm super excited that we're now starting on these mini workshops. And Yeah, if you have any questions on any of this, whether you're watching it now live or on replay, post on LinkedIn, send us an email. Any questions? Treat your team to the workshop. Again, these are designed to be so short. Think about maybe having your team. I did not see the link in the chat, and I'll put that up. Yeah, so there's been a little bit of a challenge with the broadcasting platform we use and LinkedIn. So hopefully I'm pronouncing your name, Cohen, correctly. I'll make sure that I'll post again in LinkedIn that same information, just to make sure that it's coming through.
Well, it's just early on. I see it in the chat early above Thomas's question. Isn't that the right link?
Yeah, it is.
But it doesn't come through to everybody.
Yeah, sometimes it doesn't come through to everyone, or you're seeing it in the so someone else. Yeah. So on the comments, if you're watching this on LinkedIn, I've posted there twice, and I'll have to do a refresh and make sure that it's coming through. But yeah, the link is there, and LinkedIn went off at some time. Okay. Yeah, so there's been LinkedIn's had some challenges lately. I've noticed on some of the live streams that we've done and some of the live streams that I've actually attended. But I'll, for those of you, if you aren't seeing it, what I'll also do is I'll send you the link in a instant message on LinkedIn as well, just to make sure that you've got it. All right, Al, any closing thoughts?
No, I think we covered it. It'll be an engaging workshop. We're very pragmatic, very practical. Yeah. I've got, and we're not stuck on any one way of doing it. That's the other thing. So it's like, both of us really come from what are the principles underneath it, but then we talk about these specifics to make it practical so you understand what we're talking about specifically. So I think you find it very interesting and applicable to whatever type of work you do.
Yeah, whatever type of work you do, any type of way of working you've got, this is all going to be applicable.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you on the next one.